Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a couple of trades made by the San Jose Sharks. As the deadline gets closer and closer, now just 2 days away on Friday, the trade market around the league has really begun to heat up, and Mike Greer deciding to dip his toes in it today with a couple of more minor moves being made. Now, the first of which occurred many hours ago at this point, much earlier today, and I'd originally decided to not make a video about it simply because it wasn't the type of deal that seemed to move the needle all that much. And when I make videos, I usually like to be able to discuss them for a few minutes, and there just simply wasn't enough here. But a couple of hours ago, the Sharks made a second trade, one that was at least a little bit more interesting, and so why not combine the two into this one singular video? Now, that first trade, the Sharks send Vanecek to the Florida Panthers in exchange for Patrick Giles. Now, yesterday we saw that Vanecek was held out of the Sharks lineup, was supposed to start that night against the Buffalo Sabres, but not ending up being the case. And I think the first question that many San Jose Sharks fans were asking was who in their right mind is trading for Vanecek? Because while his last couple of performances had been pretty good, the performance over the entirety of this season has left a lot to be desired. Statistically, he has been one of the worst performing goaltenders in the entire league this season. And so who would possibly be desperate enough to take him on? Well, enter the Florida Panthers, who just a few days ago traded their, at the time, backup goaltender Spencer Knight to the Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for defenseman Seth Jones. They needed someone with a little bit more experience, and while Vanecek has not been good this year, he has historically had some success, and so he was their goalie of choice. Now, at the same time, there was a very real opportunity cost for the Panthers to actually pick him up, with the entirety of his $3.4 million contract having to be eaten there, since the Sharks had no ability to retain any money, and there simply is not enough value in Vanecek as a player to fit in a third-party team. And while this contract does not extend into next season, so he's not going to alter any team's off-season plans, it is an opportunity cost nonetheless, because if you take on that full contract, that is $3.4 million less that you have to spend on any other free trade deadline pickup that you might want to make. And so in terms of a return here, it didn't really feel as though the Sharks would be able to get much. I had joked that perhaps we would end up seeing our return of our favorite friend, future considerations, but perhaps maybe at best like a 6th round draft pick. But the Sharks do end up getting a roster player out of this, which is certainly more interesting to discuss than a just simple draft pick, since that's just a placeholder name on a piece of paper. A roster player at least is a bit of a known quantity, and that's exactly what Patrick Giles is. Not a prospect. He's not a 19 or 20-year-old player who you never know what they might pan out to be in a couple of years. He's not old at 25 years of age, but this is about what you would expect out of this type of player. You're not going to get much of an alteration to his game. Now, back at the beginning of the year, he actually had a very promising preseason with the Florida Panthers, enough so to not necessarily make the starting roster, but to be their immediate call-up because he had been waiver exempt. And by game 3 of the season, Patrick Giles was in the Florida Panthers lineup. Unfortunately for him, in the little amount of ice time he received in these games, he didn't actually make as much of an impact as he would have liked. 9 games played, 0 points during that time span. He would then get sent back down to the AHL, where he has remained since then. And in the 39 games he's played with the Charlotte Checkers in the AHL, he has just 7 points. So there's not exactly a ton of offensive production here to really hang your hat on if you are a San Jose Sharks fan. With him not being a prospect and not really putting up super promising numbers, what was the reason for bringing him in? Well, it seems at this point it's probably just to be a warm body to fill out this Sharks roster. If he was able to crack a Panthers roster even just briefly, and that was a team that won the Stanley Cup last season, one could imagine he'd at least be a serviceable enough fourth liner for this Sharks team. And with the fact that they may very well end up trading away one of, if not both, Luke Kunin and Nico Sturm over these next couple of days, someone does have to play, and it seems as though the Sharks have been rather hesitant in ruining the whatever chemistry is going on with the San Jose Barracuda, at least on the forward side of things. And so Patrick Giles is that type of fill-in who could end up playing in the Sharks' bottom 6 for the next 19 games to finish out this season. There's nothing really special here, but I guess you never really know. The second trade, however, as I mentioned, carries a little bit more intrigue here, as the Sharks send a 5th round pick in 2028 to the Pittsburgh Penguins in exchange for defenseman Vincent Desharnais. Now, we have to address the elephant in the room here. Yes, this 5th round pick is from 2028. That is not this year's draft. That is not next year's draft. That is not even the year after that's draft. It is the year after that. This is quite far into the future. You don't usually see teams, quite rarely do you see teams trade a draft pick that far in advance because you don't really have a good read on what is going to actually be available in 2028. But if the Penguins were so keyed in on picking up a 5th round pick in this deal and the Sharks perhaps wanted to hold on to this year's 5th rounder, they didn't have much other choice because in 2026, that one was traded away for Kalen Addison, and in 2027, it was traded away for Mackenzie Blackwood. So indeed, 3 years down the line, the Sharks will be out a 5th rounder, something that probably won't really make much of an impact at all for this team. And so essentially, you're picking up this Vincent Desharnais player and not really giving much up for him. Now, what is Desharnais going to end up bringing to the table is, of course, the question. Well, we know one of the major reasons for why Greer brings him in is because he has the size, he has the strength. He is a 6'7" behemoth on skates, a ton of size, and is willing to use it as well. And while the Sharks do have some height on their blue line with guys like Mukhamadullin and Thrun, in the early parts of their career, they're not very imposing nor intimidating players. Really, the only kind of wrecking ball type of guy the Sharks have on their blue line currently is Mario Ferraro. So bringing in someone like Desharnais helps shore that up, which is certainly not something that I'm fully against. But there are a lot of question marks here with this acquisition. The first of which is just how much success Desharnais is actually going to be able to have on this team. Now, he was previously with the Penguins. That's who the Sharks are trading him from, but he was not there for a while. He had been originally acquired in the Marcus Pettersson deal from the Vancouver Canucks. That is where he started this season off. Last year, though, he was with another different team, that being the Edmonton Oilers, and that means he made it all the way to the Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. But unlike Cody Ceci, a former San Jose Sharks defenseman, he was not a mainstay top 4 defenseman. He was someone who was at times in and out of the lineup and only played like a handful of around 15-ish minutes per game. It's not a minor role, but it's not necessarily a big thing either. But he had a decent amount of success in that position with the Oilers. The problem is that Edmonton, very different team than what San Jose is. And with the Oilers being a skilled squad, they could make up for some of the deficits in Desharnais' game, something that the Sharks don't really have the ability to do. One of the major issues the Sharks have had this season is just being able to clear pucks out of their own zone. And while Desharnais certainly has the size and strength to bully of people around and clear out the front of the net, he doesn't quite have the speed or the skill to contest pucks along the board, 50-50 pucks like that. He's not really going to be a huge help to your ability to get pucks out of the zone unless you just plan on icing them 24/7. So that could be a potential expose moment for Desharnais if he ends up getting caught in too many of these situations, and knowing the Sharks, that very well could end up happening. The next question mark is where exactly Desharnais actually fits into the lineup this season. Yesterday, we saw the Sharks run a healthy top 6 of Wallman, Liljegren, Mukhamadullin, Ferraro, Thompson, and Vlasic. Their 7th defenseman was Jimmy Schultz, having to be essentially emergency called up from the San Jose Barracuda because of the injury to Henry Thrun. Now, they would obviously love to have Schultz back with the Barracuda, and so bringing in a 7th defenseman to actually fill in instead does make a lot of sense. But the problem here is that Desharnais is not being brought in most likely to just ride the bench. He is likely going to be someone who gets into the lineup. We saw Warsofsky be a big fan of Jan Ruda. Why would he not be a big fan of what Desharnais brings to the table? And so, with Desharnais being a righty, and so is Jack Thompson, it is very likely that Thompson will be the one stepping out, and we will end up seeing a third pairing of Vlasic and Desharnais. Now, already, that kind of brings up some PTSD moments of Ruda Ferraro back at the beginning of the season. 2 defensemen that are not very good at moving the puck could end up being an absolute disaster in their own zone. But on top of that, having someone like Jack Thompson step out of the lineup, as inconsistent as he has been this season, he wasn't very good yesterday against Buffalo, but he had been rather good against Toronto the day before that. Even though there is those inconsistencies, over the final 19 games of a season that is essentially lost at this point, would I rather see a young prospect defenseman like Thompson play over a very much known quantity in Vinny Desharnais? I would definitely side with Thompson in that particular case, and we may not end up getting that situation, which I think would be a little bit unfortunate. On top of that, even though this is the Sharks' current healthy 7 defensemen, there are a couple of players on the sidelines with injury. The first of which is Jan Rutta. We are not aware of how serious the injury is to Rutta. Could he be back by the time the Sharks are back in San Jose, or maybe he will not play another game this season? Who can possibly say with the little amount of information that the organization gives us? But if he does end up being healthy enough to return to the lineup at some point, I mentioned Warsofsky, big fan of Jan Rutta. He has literally never healthy scratched him this season when he's been available. Does Rutta end up taking a lineup spot here? Well, the only player who he could theoretically replace in that case, since I don't think they're running a third pairing of Rutta Desharnais and replacing Vlasic, would be someone like Shakir Mukhamadullin. And if Warsofsky ends up taking Mukhamadullin out of the Sharks lineup in favor of Jan Rutta, I'm going to lose my mind, because that would be the worst possible move. That would be like having Barclay Goodrow be the first liner alone 1v3 on the ice. That's how terrible of a decision that would actually end up being. I do not want to see that happen, but it is technically a possible reality that we could end up living in. The other injured defenseman that currently sits on the sidelines is Henry Thrun. Again, completely unaware of how long this injury might be. Is he back for the next game? Are we going to have to wait till April? Who could possibly say? At the very least, however, if Thrun does return, I could see him end up taking Vlasic's spot on that third defensive pairing and playing with Desharnais, which actually might end up being a relatively solid D pairing, but it would of course end up with Vlasic being the 7th defenseman and then Jack Thompson heading back to the San Jose Barracuda. So in the end, it is that same type of casualty situation here. But even if this year things do work out and the pieces fall into place, next year is also a question mark, because Vinny Desharnais is not on an expiring contract. He is under deal for the following season as well. Now, as a right-handed defenseman, at the very least, he is filling in a role that the Sharks are somewhat lacking in, but at the same time, we have seen San Jose be very willing to have left-handed defensemen play on the right side. Thrun has done so, Mukhamadullin has done so. It has happened, and while it's not optimal, obviously, it is not the end of the world either. And going into next season, we know that there are going to be many young Sharks defensemen gunning for a roster spot. Obviously, Thrun, Mukhamadullin, Thompson, all 3 of those players could theoretically factor into a top 6. At least 2 of them, I imagine, with Mukhamadullin and Thrun. But on top of that, a guy like Luca Cagnoni, perhaps a guy like Sam Dickinson. If the Sharks end up drafting Matthew Schaefer at first overall or wherever they end up picking, he would probably want to make a run for that roster spot as well. Having someone like Desharnais be locked in, so to speak, which I imagine is the approach that Ryan Warsofsky would end up taking, unfortunately enough, it does create a little bit of a roadblock, which is somewhat unfortunate. Now, the good news, I guess, the possible way of spinning it is that, well, he's a 6'7" big defenseman. Teams love that type of player for a playoff run, and so the Sharks can just flip him at the deadline that year with some Stanley Cup playoff experience under his belt as well. But this was the exact type of approach we also took with Jan Rutta, and Jan Rutta was so bad this year that he became a pretty much unmovable asset at this year's deadline, more or less. Or even if he could get moved, it would be for like a 7th round pick, which is barely any sort of value whatsoever. If Desharnais is put into a position where his strengths are not really allowed to shine, and instead his weaknesses are on full display, which is very, very possible, will he even have any value at next year's trade deadline? That is a big question to really ask ourselves. Now, what this could end up being indicative of, however, which is a very important last point to be made, is if the Sharks end up making a deal that trades away a defenseman. I talked about Cunnin and Sturm being moved out, but it is possible the Sharks trade a blue liner as well, and it seems as though the prime candidate for that would probably be Mario Ferraro. I can't really see anybody else getting moved. Thrun, Mukhamadullin, Liljegren, likely all to stick around. Maybe Jake Wallman, but I'm highly doubtful of that as well. Ferraro seems to be the guy who has been involved in these trade rumors, and if Ferraro does end up getting traded away and the Sharks do not get a defenseman back in return, Desharnais fills in for that type of physical play, and you're not exactly losing a roster spot for it. You're just kind of replacing Mario Ferraro, which then ends up making it more so fine. But I have to say that I'm not fully trustworthy of what this type of player is going to end up doing to the Sharks lineup, because we have seen Warsofsky make some questionable lineup decisions before. But that will do it for this trade review. I think this was, again, two deals that really aren't going to necessarily move the needle all that much. Vanecek, you give him a chance on a contending team. That's nice to see. And then Patrick Giles, not really anyone to write home about there. The Desharnais one, it could end up being a bit of a kind of anchor here for the San Jose Sharks, but at the very least, they don't really trade away much value. And in the end, maybe it won't be that big of a deal. Class dismissed.